Just a quick overview of the gospel genre. The four gospels have specific intention. Okay, and it's helpful to know this because the gospel writers actually say this to us, and it helps to frame the way that we interpret the entire book. So you guys saw this with Mark. Who is, without looking at your notes, who was Mark written to from last year? Gentiles. And what's Mark's purpose primarily? Yeah, why? He's being evangelistic, right? So he's saying, I'm going to tell you about who the Son of God is. Can we move that water bottle over like 3 inches that way? That way Jeff doesn't have to. Thank you. Perfect. I'm going to tell you that Jesus is the Son of God. That way you know the Christ. That way you can be saved. And that's his main purpose, the evangelism of Gentiles. Okay? And we actually see that. Which text? Mark 1:1, right? Mark 1:15. That's so clear. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Boom. That's what he's doing, right? That's his purpose. Okay? So he's evangelistic. His main theme, most people say, is that Jesus is the Son of God. Okay? That he is the Son of the Most High God. And he uses certain phrases consistently to make that clear. Okay? So that's Mark. Then we have the other evangelistic gospel is John. Right? John is writing to the Jews. It's an evangelistic book to the Jews. So if you ever meet a Jew and you want to share the gospel with them and you want to ask them to read a gospel, give them the Gospel of John. It's very Jewish in how it speaks. So John is a good Jew, was a good Jew. He gets saved, right? And, hey! Yeah. Little heresy, just to see if you're awake. Yeah. John was a good Jew. He gets saved. He's no longer a good Jew, but now he's a Christian, right? And so his book is an evangelistic book to the Jewish people, okay? If you're talking to a person who's non-Jewish, actually Mark is a better book for people to read if you want to give them the gospel because it's just very linear, very clear. The stories are told in a non-Jewish way, which is very helpful. Even some Jewish things get explained. Mark actually takes Jewish phrases and certain Hebraisms and he just explains them for the reader. So it's very helpful. If someone says, "What should I read first?" Say, "Are you Jewish?" And they'll be like, "What are you talking about?" Say, "Well, it makes a difference." And if they say no, then just give them Mark. So it's helpful. Okay? All right, so Mark and John are the evangelistic gospels. We know the main theme of the book of John is that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, right? That's the main theme. And there's a ton of places where that's made evident, right? All over the place. Remember, Jesus says, "I am the bread of life who came down out of heaven." We have Isaiah telling us that Isaiah saw Christ's glory when he looked on him. So you have specific links that tie Old Testament ideas of the Messiah to Christ, and John is trying to tie those things together in very explicit ways. Okay? Main theme verse for that book is 20:31, right? These things are written. If all the things that Jesus did were written, you'd have more books than the world could hold, but these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, right? So you have that statement being made explicitly for us. Okay? All right, then we have the two apologetic books, Matthew and Luke. Luke, he's the only Gentile writer of the New Testament. So who do you think he's writing to? Gentiles, right? And he actually names the guy. Anyone remember what the guy's name is? Theophilus, which means what? One who loves God. Right? So the question is there actually a guy named Theophilus out there that Luke's like, "Hello, Theophilus, let me write you a book"? Or is he writing it to one who loves God? We don't know, actually. So he says, "Most excellent Theophilus," so we're not sure if he's writing to a specific person. I believe he's writing to a specific person. That's always been the traditional view. But he could just be writing to one who loves God, and that could be a specific thing. Okay? Good? So he's apologetic. His main theme is that Jesus is the Son of Man, and we see that in 1 through 4. Okay? Apologetic, defending the faith, reasons why Jesus is God, not just that Jesus is God. So it's apologetic text. And then Matthew is an apologetic text to the Jews. It's proving that Jesus is the king, right? How do we know that? Well, his theme text is in 1:22 and 23, where it says that Christ is the son of Abraham, the son of David. So that emphasis on the son of David in Matthew is very clear. Matthew is also one of the harder books to interpret because of Matthew's use of the Old Testament. He's always dredging up these kind of obscure Old Testament passages. Like he's the famous one who does Hosea 11:1, which is one of the hardest texts to interpret, because he's bringing all these Old Testament texts to bear for Jewish people to prove things to them. Okay? Good? Okay, so the gospel accounts are, this is important language, The gospel accounts are selective, purposeful accounts of the life of Jesus. Each gospel has a thesis the author is defending to a particular audience. For Luke and John, these theses are explicitly spelled out, while Matthew and Mark have no such clear statement. Their core purposes can be inferred from the events and teachings they select, from the editorial and structural perspective the author provides. Gospel accounts are meant to persuade and equip the reader. They are not disinterested, neutral presentations of the facts, but instead are evangelical treatises. Through their course, they develop arguments based on evidence supporting their claims. For example, Matthew extensively uses the Old Testament as proof of the validity of Jesus' teaching, while Luke emphasized historical accuracy and Jesus' innocence by Roman legal standards. You know, why? Well, these guys are defending certain components of the faith, right? Now, there are purposeful reasons why they include what they include. So Luke is purposefully trying to convince Romans that Jesus is innocent when he dies. Why would that be so important to the Roman people? If someone gets crucified by the Romans, what's the implication of that? Right, exactly. He deserved it, right? There's smoke, that means there must be fire, he must have done something wrong. And so Luke is creating an account that makes it clear that he's innocent, right? What in Luke's account makes it so clear that he's innocent? You remember? We can look. It's very explicit. It's in chapter 23. That's the first time. So Pilate says, I find no guilt in him. And then what does he do with him? He sends him to Herod. And then Herod says, I find no guilt in him. He sends him back to Pilate, right? And then Pilate actually says, look at verses 13 through 16. This is so interesting. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, I have examined him before you. I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod. For he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. That is line for line Roman legal code, right? This is what you're supposed to do. You take it from one magistrate to the higher magistrate. The higher magistrate says, no, there's no problem. He sends him back to the lower magistrate for punishment and release. That's the purpose of this thing. So Pilate is effectively saying, this guy is 100% innocent. He does not deserve to die. Okay? Which is very interesting, because in a way, that's actually subversive. At the end of the day, that means the Roman legal system made a mistake with Jesus, right? Which is very interesting, because they did put him to death. Pilate puts him to death. So, anyway. Okay, so the Gospels provided the early church with authoritative teaching against the backdrop of emerging heresy and other challenges faced by the early Christian church. Note the teachings on the danger and rewards of discipleship in Mark and the emphasis on Christology in John, for example. Those are two examples that you can look at and see those types of teachings. Okay? All right. So, we want to understand how Jesus is portrayed in the Gospels. Okay? First off, Jesus is a rabbi, right? Why is that important? He's a Jewish man teaching Jewish people, right? So he's teaching as a rabbi, as a teacher. The gospel authors, many who heard Jesus speak, regarded him as a teacher, a rabbi. The term is used 40 times in the Gospels, okay? With that in mind, it's helpful to be aware of common rabbinical figures of speech, how they were used to convey meaning to an audience at the time. When using one of these forms, typically a single general point is made, and the context is crucial for seeing the point. Now, somehow this chart ended up on 2 pages, so I apologize. But the figure of speech is first, right? The definition of that figure of speech, and then the text where that figure of speech is used. Those are the 3 columns. Okay? Now, we don't have to look at all these, but this is just helpful to note. Okay? Jesus was using common rabbinic methods for teaching. When he taught the people, he taught with common rabbinic methods. He used play on words, right? He used similes all over the place. He uses metaphors, he uses proverbs, he uses riddles, right? Puzzling, complex stories. He uses paradoxes. All these things he uses to communicate truth to the people in various different ways, okay? Which, when you're reading, I think we naturally see that, but it's important for us to know. Jesus is functioning as a rabbi, and therefore he's teaching in specific ways. That's good for us to see and know. Yes, ma'am? From greater to lesser. I mean, from lesser to greater. Yeah. If this is true, how much more must this be true? Right? We see those all over the place. Like, if you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more would God, being good, give good gifts to his children? Okay? All right, so when you're reading the Gospels and you're interpreting the text, you have to be careful because Jesus is functioning as a Jewish rabbi, right? A lot of times we can take language that sounds odd to us and misinterpret it because we don't think of it as a Jewish rabbinic teaching. Okay? That's the first one. Second one, Jesus as prophet. Any questions on that one, by the way? Any questions on anything we talked about at this point? You know you can just raise your hand and interrupt me at any time, correct? Okay, good. Yes, sir.
With like Luke, and I know you touched on the Acts as well.
Mm-hmm.
Did you say it is or isn't trying to? Is it writing in any way to try and kind of distinguish like political movement versus? Because I've heard that before, but I didn't know whether that was true or not true.
What do you mean
distinct? Like in the sense that like that Luke is writing into a context of like the Roman authorities thinking like, hey, do we want to trying to sort of like it's actually like functioning as an apologetic to the Roman government. Yeah, there's like something like that. Like I kind of almost assumed that's not true, but then
I would tend to think not. The main reason for that is because Luke actually says, I've actually done all the research on this. I've studied. I know who's doing what. He has all that stuff already. Like what's the right word? He's communicating something to people to prove something about Christ, but not necessarily to like make political inroads or protect this nascent movement from political control or anything like that. I would probably say no on that stuff, but yes on the convincing Gentiles that this is okay.
But like so that what you were saying, just because what you were saying with it's almost subversive in the sense that Pilate went back to his words. It's almost like we would play against that, right? Which would be
I mean I think Luke doesn't call that out. He doesn't say. Now Pilate changed his mind and actually executed an innocent man. But the point is, he's showing this guy was actually innocent. He died, but he was innocent. So he's more or less defending Christ as opposed to like protecting the movement itself from political interference. Does that answer it?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Good. Any other questions? Always fun. Okay, good. Jesus as prophet, okay? So in addition to being regarded as a teacher, Jesus is also recognized throughout the Gospels as a prophet. There's a number of places there. I put some text in there for you. Notice how he is shown as one who shared the characteristics of the Old Testament prophets, right? He performed prophetic signs and miracles. His message was inspired by the Holy Spirit. He claimed a divine calling and message. As with Old Testament prophets, he was rejected. So all of those are ways that Jesus is being identified as a prophet. I should have put this in here, but what text is the promise of a coming prophet who would be like Moses? Anyone remember offhand? No, close. Deuteronomy 18. Look at Deuteronomy 18 really quickly. Verse 15. And then we'll look at John 6 really quickly because it shows up there too. But this is really interesting. Deuteronomy 18:15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen. You shall listen to him. This is according to all that you asked of the Lord your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God. Let me not see this great fire anymore. I will die. The Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you. I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. It shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. Okay, so promise of a coming prophet who's going to be like Moses. Okay? The Jewish mind, when they read this, they don't think Elijah or Elisha or any of those guys. They're thinking messianic. Okay? There's one who's going to come. So in the Old Testament, the guy who's the most important guy is Moses, right? And a guy is going to come who's going to be like Moses, who's going to give the people the same things that Moses gave them. Okay? So look at John 6. Really interesting. You guys know the story, what happens in John 6? We have the feeding of the 5,000, right? So he feeds the 5,000, and it's really a beautiful picture. John 6, 1 through 15, you have the story of him feeding the 5,000, but look at verse 14. It says, therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, this is truly the prophet who has come into the world. And why do they say truly the prophet? Well, that's Deuteronomy 18, right? It's this one. Why does the bread being made and them being fed by him connect him to Moses? The manna from heaven, right? And Jesus actually says, I am the bread out of heaven. You came eating barley loaves, I'm the bread out of heaven. So you have him saying, this is who I really am. I really am the prophet who's come into the world. But it's much bigger than what you even understand. Right? Moses fed you with bread that fell out of the sky. I'm giving you real bread. I'm giving you myself. Okay? Good? All that makes sense? Okay, good. So that's Jesus as prophet. Third, we have Jesus has a unique authority. The Gospels attest to Jesus' unique authority as a teacher and a prophet. His authority above the teachings of others through his use of the phrase, you have heard, but I say. Right? We have the Sermon on the Mount over and over and over again. You've heard it said, but I say to you. Right? So what's he doing? Is he giving a new law in the Sermon on the Mount? No. What's he doing? He's expanding. He's saying, here's what it really means to not lust. Here's what it really means to not steal, right? So he's taking the law code and he's saying, in actual fact, you want to be holy? Here's what you have to do. Not only can you not commit adultery, you can't lust. Not only can you not steal, you can't even covet. Like, you can't do those things. You can't go underneath and do them. You can't murder, yeah, but you also can't be angry. So he's showing what it means to truly keep the Old Testament law. Okay? Good? Good. Okay, then we also have the testimony of John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist says he is a new authority greater than any of the prophets. John says, I must increase, he must decrease, that famous passage, right? In John 3. And then Jesus' use of the I am statements, indicating to his claim to deity, right? If anyone ever says, Jesus never claimed to be God, what do you say? Yes, he did. He did over and over and over and over and over and over again in the book of John because he said, I am, I am, I am. And then he said, before Abraham was, I am. So, what was that? No, it's just ego in me. But before, so Abraham rejoiced to see my day. And then he says, before Abraham was, I am. So it's the transcendental reality that Jesus exists outside of time as the second member of the Trinity being stated just with that being verb. Yeah. Yahweh doesn't exactly mean I am. It's actually got no meaning. It's actually just like, it does mean I am, but it doesn't actually have any like specific meaning. It's an unpronounceable word in Hebrew. There's no vowels in Hebrew, and Yahweh is you can't pronounce those four letters together. There's no way to pronounce it. It's like yuh. That's it. So you can't really pronounce it, and the idea is that God is Yahweh. He's impronounceable. He's like transcendental, greater than anything that exists. It comes from the verb being, the same being verb, and it means that idea, like I exist, but like that specific thing is not used. Good. Okay, and then Jesus' use of parabolic acts as teaching devices. This is always careful. We always have to be careful with this. Many times the Gospels show Jesus making a point, a teaching in a sense, through an action instead of through a spoken teaching. Many times Jesus performed a miraculous sign not only as a simple act of mercy, but also to make a theological point about the nature of God, man, and God's plan of salvation. He often employed actions that were symbolic of these theological points. Remember that Jesus' actions were taken against the backdrop of Judaism at that time. He was a controversialist, and his teachings were designed to inflame opposition to God and dramatically demonstrate God's mercy. With that in mind, notice where, when, and for whom the action in a particular passage is performed. Ask yourself, what is the significance of this demonstration in this particular context to Jesus' original audience? One real clear example in Mark, we have that Markan sandwich with Jairus' daughter and who? Yeah, the one with the issue of blood. What does he do? What do his actions say in that narrative?
He touches someone.
Yeah. He says, someone touched me, right? And he turns around in the crowd and he says, who touched me? And a woman comes forward who's unclean and she says, I touched you. What should Jesus do at that point? As a good Jew, what should he do? Well, I mean, yes. But now what is he? If she's unclean, she touched him. He's unclean himself. He should withdraw from the crowd. right? So what he does there is he actually says, no, actually, your faith has made you well. He takes cleanness and pushes it to her, and that is actually like totally countercultural. All the Jews are like, what in the world? And she attests, it's gone. Like, I'm healed. So that in a Jewish context, that's an incredibly powerful moment. We don't really get it because we're like, okay, her faith made her well. That's great. But all that cleanliness issue and all of the ritual purity is all going on there at the same time as well. Good? Okay, good. Okay, so when it comes to gospel interpretation, there's a narrow interpretation. When I say narrow, what does that mean? The individual text you're interpreting at any given moment, right? That story of Jairus and the woman with blood. That's an individual text, okay? So you can actually break that down even smaller. Just the woman with blood, okay? So what do we do when we're going to examine specific narrow context? Well, the first thing we want to do is look at the context, always, right? What are the preceding and subsequent passages? Note the events and themes of the passages that come before and after the one you're studying. Think about how they might relate to passages you are studying. This gives you clues about your passage's purpose. Okay, so we're looking for the purpose in the passage itself from the context. The Gospels often continue Jesus' teaching by showing it in action, or conversely, by following up Jesus' actions with clarifying teaching. For example, Matthew concludes the Sermon on the Mount with the observation, he was teaching them as one having authority. What should we do? Ding, 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 ding. Matthew's telling us exactly what's going on there, right? Jesus has authority to give them a full interpretation of the Mosaic Law. Okay? Then we see in Matthew 8 and 9 that Jesus demonstrates his authority in a series of miracles. An example of Jesus' actions setting up his teaching can be found in John 6. The feeding of the 5,000, Jesus performs the miracle and then declares, I am the bread of life. Okay? So you have him acting and speaking, and these things work concurrently. So we want to look at the broader context to understand the specific text. Second, the introductory or explanatory statements are often helpful. Note if the author provides an introductory or explanatory statement within the passage that helps set up or summarize his passage. For example, the Pharisees' question in Matthew 15:2. Why do Jesus' disciples violate traditions by eating with ritually unwashed hands? It's like playing t-ball, right? They're like, hit the ball, right? So they ask this question, and then the whole point of the gospel narrative is Jesus is going to correct their thinking about what it means to be pure and impure. Okay? Good. There's a couple editorial devices of the narrator that help readers understand the dramatic moments and therefore the significance of Jesus' teaching or actions. For example, John 7:1 shows the great hostility towards Christ in Judea. So when Jesus later arrives in Judea, conflict is inevitable. Okay, so those kinds of things are happening all the time in the gospel accounts. You want to watch for those. Introductory statements or when the author specifically mentions something. Okay? Okay, second, we want to identify. Now again, just to be clear, we've covered all this, but we're just talking about it a little more specifically in the context of the Gospels. So we want to identify who, characters, right? Describe each person in the scene, noting characteristics that the narrator identifies. Where are they from? Are they friend or foe? Are they portrayed as a positive example or a cautionary example? The more you understand about the characters, the more vivid your understanding of the scene will be, right? And always remember, God is a character in the passages, often, right? Oftentimes, God is a character in the passages. What's the most clear time when God is a character in any text in the Gospels? Yes, very good. What does he do?
Shut up, Peter.
Yeah, literally. He's like, stop. Enough, right? That's literally what he does, which is great because then as a reader, you're like, oh, Peter's wrong, right? So you realize that, and it makes you deal with the text in a new way. Okay. Otherwise, you might think, oh, maybe Peter had a pretty good idea, but he didn't. Okay, good. Okay, so we want to know who. Second, we want to know where, the location. Where is the action happening, and is there any significance to that? Why are the characters where they're at? Is the narrative taking place? Ooh, I got to turn the page. Sorry, they're stuck together. Taking place in a place where controversy is likely. For example, John 4, where Jesus talks to a woman in Samaria. Why is that so bad? She's a woman in Samaria. And what else do we find out about her? She's not great. So you have a huge problem with Jesus sitting by the well and saying, hey, can you give me some water? Which we don't think. We're like, he's just asking for water. It's not a big deal. Right? But it is a huge deal. Everything that happens there is a huge deal culturally. Okay? Good? Good. And then when we have time, when does the narrative take place? In general, what in general could be said about these times that help our understanding about the particular story matter? The day of the week is obviously important. Is the narrative cast on the Sabbath? Why might that matter? It seems like basically all the stories are on the Sabbath, right? Nothing really happened from Monday to Friday. When you read the Gospels, it's like Sabbath on the Sabbath. They're on the Sabbath, and they're on the Sabbath. Why? What's the issue that the Gospel writers are calling out?
It's violating the Pharisees' law.
Exactly. You have all this man-made tradition, and Jesus is like intentionally knocking all of their traditions over, walking through and knocking those traditions over to help them see that those things aren't actually real. Okay? So all those things we need to watch for. Okay? And then third, teaching or narrative. We want to be careful. Is it a teaching or a narrative text, right? Outline the flow of the narrative or teaching. It's helpful to break the passage down into scenes. For example, in Matthew 15, 21 through 28, there are 3 scenes. There's a woman's request. Jesus talks to his disciples. Jesus talks to the woman, right? So you have 3 different scenes that are happening there. And each one of those is an independent idea that's being communicated by the gospel writer. Each scene plays a role in forming the main point. And then you want to go from that to determining what is the main point. So tips for identifying the main point of the passage. There's a bunch here. Look for summary, conclusion, or introductory statements, either by the author, there's some examples there, or as a conclusion placed in the mouth of a character, right? The characters tell us when the conclusion is made. Look for imperative command statements, right? You have all sorts of imperative command statements. John 3. Who's he talking to in John 3:7? Nicodemus. What's his command? You must be born again. What's the point of the passage? You must be born again. But that's it, right? You don't have to struggle to know what's going on in John 3. He's telling him regeneration is the only way into the kingdom of God. You got to be born again. And everything else connects to that idea. And you can just stack it all on top of that idea. Okay? Good. Repetition of a key term or concept, right? Matthew 8 and 9, the repetition of his authority to act. Luke 15. Remember Luke 15? What are the 3 stories in Luke 15? Lost coin, lost sheep, lost son, right? Huh? Yeah, prodigal son. Lost coin, lost sheep, lost son. What's the point? Lost things have value, right? That's what God is saying. The lost sheep of the house of Israel are valuable to me in that text. Okay? Next one, context. We want to look for context, like in Luke 18, the question of who then can be saved is answered by Jesus, that the things that are impossible for men are possible with God, and that's followed by who? Bartimaeus and Zacchaeus, right? So who are those 2 people? A blind man and a tax collector. It's impossible for anyone to be saved apart from God, but when God works, God can do things, and that's what is being communicated in those 2 salvation stories. And then you want to look for connective words, such as thus, therefore, so, for this reason, which indicate a conclusion. The use of figures of speech, such as irony, parallelism, a fortiori, and the use of truly as an authoritative declaration of fact. Okay? And then want to look for how that main point. So we're seeking that main point, right? Those are all the things that can help us see the main point of the specific story that the gospel writer is teaching us. And then from that main point, then we can take that main point and say, well, how is that being illustrated and applied from around the story and how the story is being communicated? Okay? Now there's 2 ways to interpret the Gospels, right? One is to interpret the Gospels synoptically. What would that look like?
By adding all the various accounts together and trying to drive at the main truth.
Exactly. Or the main event, yeah. So then we're looking historically. So you're interpreting historically, what would you do? You're going to read about the feeding of the 5,000. You're going to read all 4 gospel accounts of the feeding of the 5,000 and try to piece together what happened on that event. Okay? The other thing you can do is use the text itself from the gospel writer and say, what is this gospel writer teaching me about Christ from the feeding of the 5,000? There's different stories and different descriptions of that same event, and each gospel writer uses it for different reasons. Okay? Does that make sense? Like, for example, what does Mark use the feeding of the 5,000 for? You guys remember? Do you remember? Hard. Not the same thing John does. Mark uses it to prove his power, his authority, right? So he says, so they're like, what are we even going to do? And they're like debating with each other, right? John uses it to prove Christ's messiahship, right? This is the prophet who is to come. So you have Mark's account, which is using it to describe Jesus as God, and we have John's account using it to describe Jesus as Messiah. Same event, right? And the authors are using it for different purposes. So you can teach it from the authorial perspective, or you can teach it from the synoptic perspective, where you put everything together. Too cold? Oh yeah. Understandable. Well, I'm here in a vest, and I'm talking the whole time, and I still feel pretty chilly. So it's great. I'm loving every minute of it. All right. Good. Does that make sense?
So when you say, so I spent the whole of last year trying not to do the synoptic thing.
Yeah.
Because that's what McCarthy was doing.
Yeah.
but also because I just kept getting so fixated on the narrative, almost
Yeah.
being like sucked in, and then realizing, oh yeah, Mark's trying to say something to me.
Yeah.
So it's like the cross is the hardest when you're doing
Yeah. Yeah.
You kind of just get so wrapped up in this huge.
It's the event.
Pivot,
Yeah.
Rather than actually, when I read Kevin's commentary, I really struggled with it, and I really had to go back and.
Yeah.
I actually said to Kevin, I don't understand.
Jeff, you can just turn it off.
I did.
Oh, really? Oh, there it goes. It shut off. Just when you get up.
So I really struggle with that because I listened to you guys teach on it, and Kevin sent that out. I was like,
yeah.
But I did kind of, the more I spend it, the more I realize Kevin was totally right.
Yeah.
But so you would say that it's fine to teach?
It's fine to teach it that way. So ideally, you want to do both. You want to teach exactly what happened and use the other gospel accounts to inform what this gospel writer is saying. So you might be able to pull in other data to understand what's going on synoptically. But then from there say, so what is Mark doing in this text? And then you communicate what's happening from a Markan perspective, which is hard to do. You have to keep both those things in your head all the time.
But isn't it true that Luke, for example, he was not present in
right.
So he basically took one of the Gospels, or he spoke to someone to capture it, right?
Yeah, we wouldn't say that he took a gospel. He actually tells us how he did it. He says, I investigated these things on my own. So he specifically talks to the people who were eyewitnesses. So Luke was with Paul, Luke was with Peter, he was with Mary, he was in Jerusalem for a season. So he was able to talk to these people. And as a Roman historian, and as a well-educated man, he's asking questions and taking notes and putting together his own gospel account, which he then writes for us. So he's not present, but he writes it on the basis of eyewitness accounts that he gathers.
So he didn't use like Mark's writing and then...
Yeah, I would say no. Yeah, I don't think there's that much interdependence for lots of reasons. One is that Luke seems to be writing his gospel account in Acts earlier than Mark wrote his text. So even if we take an early date for Mark, it would be very difficult for Luke to have Mark and then be trying to put those things together. Luke would have known Mark. In fact, Luke traveled with Mark, with Paul. So I think in terms of the interaction with the two of them, it's kind of hard to say, well, he was dependent on the Markan text, and then he's building from that Markan text. It's better to say these are four independent accounts. Mark is taking Peter's account. Matthew was present because he was one of the disciples. Luke interviews eyewitnesses. And these three now come together as three synoptic eyewitness communications. And then John was present, obviously. But John just picks up crazy stuff and adds things in. He's got like 60 years to think about what should be in a gospel. And he's like, all right, now we're going to do this. And he writes the whole thing out. Okay, so that's a narrow interpretation. You're interpreting one text. But then there's this funky sort of broad discourse level interpretation in the Gospels, which is much more complex, right? It's very difficult. This is point 4. You want to examine the overall flow of a theme through multiple passages, right? The Gospel writers often use various stories strung together to provide one single meaning or theological principle. Be on the alert when stories seem to be repeated or have similar themes. For example, the repetition of the story of Christ's disclosure of his future suffering and the disciples' response to it in Mark. What's he teaching there? Don't be like these guys. Literally, over and over, 3 times in a row, it's like, these guys are dumb. These guys are dumb. These guys are dumb. That's what they're saying. That's what Mark is communicating. All 3 of those stories. And he does it 3 times. Why does he do it 3 times? Yeah, it's the emphasis of completion. They're really dumb, right? That's what he's saying, right? So all the way through, almost to the cross, you have them arguing over positions of authority and people, mothers coming out and talking to him, all sorts of stuff happening. He's communicating something to his reader in a broader context, not in the specific story context. So you want to interpret each one of those individually in their context, and then you want to interpret all 3 of those together in one broad discourse level understanding. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Okay, good. Well, okay. Some people nod like this, apparently. No, just kidding. Okay, second example, Luke 15. The 3 stories linked together to show God's heart for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, right? We have the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. He's communicating something about the lost people in Israel. That's what God is using that to communicate. Additionally, there are two ways to broadly interpret the Gospels. One is synoptically. We already talked about this. The other is to interpret them individually, seeking authorial intent. Both are valid and useful for different purposes. Good? That's the Gospels. Any questions on the Gospels? Okay, when you're interpreting the Gospels, I think personally the Gospels are some of the hardest texts to interpret in the whole Bible. Because you're dealing with all sorts of crossover. There's Jewishness and all these things happening. Of all the Gospels, Mark is the easiest. I think the other three are more complex. But all three of them, all four of them are very difficult. Some of the hardest texts to interpret in the whole Bible. Yeah?
When the Gospels refer back to the Old Testament text,
Yeah.
Since those writers are all from different backgrounds, are they pretty much in unity about what that meant, or are there differences between them?
There's really not. I don't think there's any differences between them. I think there's unity in what the original interpretation was. Yeah. That's a good question, though.
But because I was just trying to think, like, the Gentile writers are maybe not so familiar with the Old Testament, like, but some Gentiles knew the Old Testament, right? Some had studied it.
Yeah. Well, Luke, so you got to realize, like, Luke, he's the only Gentile writer, but he traveled with Paul for years. Like, at that point, Luke is probably one of the most well-educated guys in terms of Judaism of anybody. Paul would have been, like, sitting with him and explaining text to him and helping him understand how things fit together and all that stuff. So, no, Mark's a Jew. Yeah. No, he's just Jewish. Yeah.
But you don't think they collaborated?
Mark and Luke? No, I don't think so. I think they wrote independently. In terms of like first off, the just tradition, like the ancient tradition, tells us that they wrote independently. Also, Mark, if you just track their movements, Luke spends most of his time with Paul. Paul stops hanging out with Mark early on in Acts, prior to Luke's arrival. So you have Paul essentially like kicking Mark to the curb. Luke shows up, and then Luke stays with Paul really for the rest of the time. And he's now communicating those things, part of which is in Jerusalem. Mark takes off and goes and hangs out with Peter through Barnabas. So yeah, I don't think they're necessarily. I don't think where they were collaborating or talking to each other. I mean, maybe maybe a little bit, but I think Luke is primarily functioning as a good Roman historian, and so as a good Roman historian, he's only talking to eyewitnesses, where Mark was not an eyewitness. Mark would have been secondhand. Yeah, and he actually tells us that, which is helpful. He tells us what his research methodology is. It's so cool. He's like, I talked to Mary. I was here. I've talked to these people, and and he even like uses language in his gospel and in Acts that reference those specific conversations. I remember in the Christmas account, it says Mary treasured these things up in her heart, and it says that 3 times. Right? What's Luke doing? He's talking and he's saying, how would Mary have remembered the birth of her child? She had 5 kids, right? How would she, more? How could she have remembered that? And he's like, well, she was treasuring these things up in her heart. She was holding on to these memories because she knew it was crazy. This was a baby that wasn't from a marriage, right? So that's what he's actually doing. He's saying, I had this conversation with her. She remembers the specifics because she had all this stuff happen to her. It was really crazy. So he's communicating to us that he had a conversation with Mary, probably in Jerusalem, where she explained what happened to him in terms of the divine, the incarnation. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Just one more thing on the synoptics. So for me, like the whole, like how would you think about the synoptic view versus like an authorial intent? There were things where, I mean, speak for Mark, so they know the gospel super well.
Yeah.
It was really helpful to say in the Transfiguration when they're coming down the mountain to refer to what Matthew's saying.
Right.
Because it helps you, like it's very hard to understand what Mark's getting at.
Totally.
And so you can refer to that to sort of uncover what Mark's thrust is about like eschatological stuff, revelation. Whereas there's other stuff where, like listening to MacArthur preach on, the end of Mark, and Mark's actually driving around like discipleship and layering basically Joseph from Arimathea with the women, and basically he's like talking about, he's like his closing things around disciple, like what a real disciple looks like. Whereas MacArthur goes and picks up, things like, basically all the burial and the sort of stuff, but he's picking that all up from John. He's talking about Nicodemus coming back. So it's almost like, not that it didn't happen, but it's always coming through the lens of Mark. So
Mhm.
how do you, when you're doing the synoptic thing, is it a case of like you're kind of putting it all together in like 360, or is it you're looking at each different lens and then bringing them all out through that specific lens, and then saying like, this is how I stitch those four things together? If there's all four
I would say the latter. Yeah, I would say that the goal always is authorial intent, right? So the synoptic tools allow us to inform what's happening, to give clarity, but the ultimate aim is, why did Mark write it this way? Or why did John say it this way? So all of those, the synoptic information is just building to the authorial intent.
So it's kind of similar to what you were doing this morning, right? Although you weren't like referencing Luke's intent.
Yeah.
You were saying like, here is basically you have this big long tube and like, Paul's over here.
Yeah.
But actually then like Acts is a thing which connects those two together.
Exactly.
And then on the other side you have like Paul in Philippians.
Yeah, Paul in Philippians 4. Yeah, exactly. So you have Paul pre-imprisonment, pre-trip to Jerusalem, Paul post-trip to Jerusalem. What happens in the middle? Well, Luke actually connects those for us.
Okay, that's
yeah.
I think for me it's like I struggled where in some senses I felt like that wasn't not just to write on McCartney. I felt like it wasn't what McCartney was doing.
Yeah.
I felt like he was doing the first thing, which was just basically like, let's just ditch the authors and let's just like come in and like, different cameras in a film set, but it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Rather than actually saying, hey, look, you can't stand inside that. You need to stand like outside of it.
Yeah. Well, I think you can stand inside of it. I think it's okay to do that. But then the sermon should always, or in our own interpretive grid even, we just want to always back away and say, okay, I see what's happening here. Why does Mark say this? Like, I think it's helpful to get a full orbed picture of what's taking place, but then to step back and then look at it and say, why does Mark say it this way? Mark has a specific thing he's seeking to communicate. And all of that stuff is going to inform how I'm reading Mark at that point. Yeah. But the main goal is authorial intent. Yeah. Good. Anything else on Gospels? Okay, Acts. Here we go. Initial interpretive information on Acts. Okay, 3 questions have to be answered before we seek to interpret Acts. Okay, Duval and Hayes bring these out. It's very helpful, right? Question 1, is Acts descriptive or prescriptive? They do a great job in helping us understand how to answer this question. I think. I enjoyed it. I thought it was good. Acts is primarily descriptive, but this is not always the case. It can function both ways, okay? How do we know? Well, how do we know if something is descriptive or prescriptive? And they give some questions here. The 5 questions that they use to evaluate this are great. Look for what Luke intended to communicate to his readers. 2, look for positive and negative examples in the characters of the story. 3, read individual passages in light of the overall story of Acts and the New Testament. 4, look to other parts of Acts to clarify what is normative. 5th, look for repeated patterns and themes. Okay, so, remember my whole missionary sermon? And I built the case that the mission model, that true missionaries are only church planners. Remember that? Which had Gus all up in arms because he was like, I was a missionary, buddy. How dare you? Right? No. But I'm taking Acts and using it prescriptively there, right? Which is tricky. Because if you do that in other parts of Acts, we have huge problems, right? Like speaking in tongues in Pentecost. So how do we know which is which? Okay. Well, if you run that idea through these 5 points, you actually see that that's what's taking place. Okay? So the first one, look for what Luke intended to communicate to his readers. What's Luke intended to communicate? That this is what Paul was doing. He was going from city to city, planting churches, and then coming back and planting and establishing elders. Second, look for positive and negative examples in the characters of the story. Paul is obviously a positive example all the way through that. So he's effectively saying this is what we ought to be doing. Okay? Third, read individual passages in light of the overall story of Acts in the New Testament. What books in Paul's letters would give us indication about how the church should be run? Pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, Titus. What does Paul leave Titus and Crete to do? Yeah, to establish elders in all the churches. So what does that tell us is Paul's intentionality, not just through the book of Acts, not just in the descriptive, but in the normative. What does Paul want to have happen? Establish churches and establish elderships. That's what he wants to have happen in every church. So that's his goal, which informs those sections of Acts, and we can look at those and say, actually, those are prescriptive for us. Those are normative for the church going forward. That's what this should look like. Does that make sense? Okay, and then Look to other parts of Acts to clarify what is normative. It gets repeated all the way through. And look for repeated patterns and themes. Again, it gets repeated all the way through. Right? So we see that repetition, and that is going to be helpful for us. Then we look at other parts of the New Testament. We're like, oh yeah, that's exactly what Paul intended to do. And all those things come together for us. Good? Good. Okay. Oh, well, yeah, I put that in there. Example, the selling of property in Acts 2 is not normative. Should you sell all your property and give the money to the church? Yes. Just kidding. Just joking. No, you should not. That's not normative at all, right? Why are they doing that? Because they're waiting for the coming of Christ. They're expecting Jesus to come, right? He doesn't come, but that's what they're waiting to do. But church planning from Acts 10 through 22 is normative, right? Why? Because we see it repeated, and you can push it through that grid, and that all comes out on the other side. Okay? Oh, we can fight. I don't. Yeah.
There's other examples of like people in Acts that like deliver letters, like I can't remember what TV or something.
It's Romans, yeah, Romans 16:1.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
But there's other people doing things.
Totally.
But that's descriptive of what they were doing.
Yeah, generally those are descriptive things.
And so we take the church planting as a big theme as normative.
Yeah.
But then those other little things where people are doing different functions is descriptive of what they were doing at that time.
Yeah, generally we would take those as descriptive. For example, Acts chapter 6, they established deacons, right? The first deacons are established. Real beautiful picture. It's really fun. What? You have a comment, Pierce? So they established deacons, right? If we just had Acts 6, I would say it would be a danger to say, well, that's normative now for the church. Because that would be the one time when deacons show up in the entire book of Acts. It never shows up again, right? They never show up again. But when Paul in the pastorals tells us this is what a deacon needs to look like, now we can go back to Acts 6 and say, oh, that's actually what those guys were. And this is the character traits that they should have. They should be these things. They should meet these standards in order to be deacons. And we can connect those two together and say, oh, that's what he's doing there. That's why we have to be.
You can go back to Old Testament too, though. You could go all the way back. You can.
Not for normative. Not for normative for the church.
Just say like when remember when Moses had 70 men was out or something.
Yeah, I mean, we could say like, yeah, we could say that generally, like, it's good to have help when you're doing lots of work. Like, generally that idea is true. But we wouldn't want to say what Moses did with the 70 elders of Israel is a normative example for the church now.
No, not normative then, but it supports that one event in Acts.
Not really, because those guys, that's never mentioned in Acts 6. They just say, hey, we need to get some guys who can help us because we can't keep up with everything. And so we need guys who are godly. Pick 6 guys who are godly. These are the 6 guys who are godly. Now you guys go and help because we need you to lead these ministries that we can't keep up with.
I thought Paul and Lee's brought out a good point about how making sure it's not kind of like what you feel or what your agenda is
Yeah.
at a certain period in time. To
Yeah.
decide what's normative and what's
Yeah,
descriptive.
totally.
Because I think that can happen.
Totally.
Based on different situations.
Yeah, which is why we always want to go to like the pastoral epistles and say, do we see this stuff repeated out here? Because that's writing post-Acts, and so you're getting information about what's happening, and you see those ideas picked up and set out over here, and you go, oh, that makes sense. That's a normative picture. Yeah. Okay, so what is Luke's overall structure and purpose in writing Acts? This is tricky. Okay, what's he doing in the book of Acts? Well, the question requires a more complex reading of the book and generates a couple of important and helpful charts. The main flow of Acts is outward, both spatially and ethnically. Luke's apparent aim is to help Theophilus, whether he's real or not, we can't know, to understand how it is that the gospel moved from a sect of Judaism to a Gentile-wide phenomenon. That makes sense, right? Like if you're a Gentile, you wouldn't be like, well, there's this Jewish guy, he got crucified, apparently he's a criminal, but I should worship him. That's hard to swallow for a Gentile, right? But what Luke is writing is this picture of how that took place. The movement from Israel all the way to the ends of the earth, right? So the answer, of course, is God's plan, but Luke follows the Apostle Paul as the main cause of this activity. So if you break down the book of Acts, here's what you see. Peter and Paul get paralleled, right? So Peter does a whole bunch of stuff, and Paul effectively does all the same stuff. What is Luke saying when he does that? Yeah, an authority, an apostle to whom? Gentiles. First half of the book, Jews. Peter does all this stuff. Paul does all this stuff. What he's literally saying is these guys are both. This is to the Jews. This is to the Gentiles. That's what Luke is saying. Okay? And like at a discourse level. Does that make sense? Good. Okay, second chart there. Very helpful. Okay, this is where we're talking spatially, right? So there's a spatial movement. You guys remember Acts 1:8? Is it at this time that you're going to restore the kingdom of Israel? Because there still will be a kingdom of Israel, right, Pierce? But, yeah, you can hide behind John Austin, but you and I both know I'm right. Okay, is it at this time that to restore the kingdom of Israel? What is his answer to them, to the disciples? It's not for you to know the times and the seasons, but you will be my witnesses, Jerusalem, Judea, uttermost parts of the earth, right? So does that happen? Well, yes, basically. Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. So we have the preparation, Pentecost, coming of the Holy Spirit. Spirit works through the apostles. There's a threat to the church. Stephen is martyred. And then what happens? Samaria. We have Philip, who converts the Samaritans, right? And then we have the conversion of Paul, the ministry of Peter beyond Jerusalem. Christianity goes to Antioch, where the Gentiles are saved. In Acts chapter 11, 12, the gospel spreads in spite of obstacles. And then we have to the uttermost parts of the earth as the Christian mission to the Gentiles continues, and Paul takes it out to the Gentiles. Okay? Does that make sense? So we have a spatial expansion of the gospel, and we also have a theological expansion of the gospel, right? We have Peter to the Jews, Paul to the Gentiles. Okay? Good. Okay, these two charts are very instructive. Peter carries the gospel to the Jews, their rejection most clearly evident in the stoning of Stephen, right? Once the leaders stone Stephen, the offer of the kingdom's done. It's over, right? And that opens the door to the prophesied gospel to the Gentiles. Peter carries the message initially, and Paul subsequently. So you just have the layout of Acts there. That's an overarching layout of Acts. Okay? And then third, how does Acts relate to us in the church now? This question must be answered after the first two questions are answered in any given text, right? The 5 questions in part 1 should provide some helpful guidelines for each passage. Again, authorial intent is crucial. If a passage is not obviously prescriptive, we must be careful to construct prescriptive interpretations. Okay? You can see how Acts can be used in very dangerous ways, right? You can use those stories to say almost anything you want. And you want to be very cautious. Very, very cautious. For example, sell all your property and give it to the church. What can we do with that if you're not a nice person? Yeah, these are generous people. Like, where are you storing up your treasures, Mr. Fuller? Right? And we could twist those texts and make it sound like, well, like this is what the church was doing. I mean, after all, they were breaking bread and listening to the teaching of the apostles, and they were selling their stuff and giving it away. What have you sold for Jesus, right? What is that? That's not good hermeneutics, and that's going to confuse people, and that's being done usually for evil motives, right? So we want to stay away from anything like that. So we want to be very careful when we interpret the book of Acts. And this happens all the time. It's very hard to interpret the book of Acts and then communicate it in a way that's not confusing and not twisting Luke's authorial intent. Okay? There you go. Gospels and Acts. Any questions on any of that? Good. Let me pray. We'll be done. Father in heaven, thank you for your word again. We rejoice that you've given it to us. Lord, I pray that you would help us to read, to interpret, to understand, Lord, to labor over the text in order to understand it clearly. Lord, I pray for each person here. Lord, I pray that you would use them, Lord, not only in their own personal study, but also as they speak to others in the church in various contexts, so that they would be able to help and encourage and bless those who need help from your word because of what they're learning here. Lord, we love you. We thank you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.